Good morning, everybody. I would like to welcome you all on behalf of the organizers to this event, to this discussion entitled The Role of Women Civil Society Organizations in Combating GBV Among Syrian Communities. We are honored today to have Nathalie Gilson, member of the Belgium Chamber of Representatives. I would like to also say that Nathalie held a senior position in the past in the Ministry of Justice, so she is familiar with this kind of discussions and to accountability and justice, I would say. Also honored to have Zainab Adimar. I'm sorry, the last name is difficult for me. Koislo, am I right?
It's fine, thank you.
From the UN UN Women Country Office in Turkey. I'm happy also that we have the Secretary General of our host, No Peace Without Justice, Nicolo Figa Talamanca. Thank you for also participating in this discussion. We have a strong panel representing Syrian civil society organizations working on combating Sgbv. So I would like to welcome you all, and I would pass the floor to our co-chair, Nathalie, please.
Thank you very much, Hussein, for your introduction. I'm now a member of the House of Representatives after having been a lawyer and working for the Ministry of Budget and Vice Prime Minister, and I was overlooking the file of all justice matter and foreign affairs, but I was not properly in the Ministry of Justice, so just for the sake of precising. Thank you very much for having asked me to co-chair this very important event on the role of women's civil society organizations in combating gender-based violence among Syrian refugee communities. 10 years ago, we remember that the citizens of Syria took the street to claim for their rights and call for a more open and democratic society. And we can remember that women were at the forefront of this movement. But unfortunately, they were met with brutal force, and the war that ensued this protest is still ravaging the country, and it has particularly targeted women and girls. Many persons forced to leave their homes and countries, separated from their families. More and more often, Syrian women have become, we can say, the leading force of their local communities, taking on new responsibilities for families. They are really breadwinners and decision makers, assuming their new role that they didn't have before. We can certainly say that a generation of Syrian women's rights defenders has evolved in the past 10 years, and we are very honored today to have some of them with us. The war in Syria has caused the biggest displacement crisis since World War II. According to the figures, over 5.5 million Syrians live as refugees abroad, and more than 6 million Syrians are displaced within their own country. Turkey hosts more than 3.6 million Syrian refugees. About half of them are women and girls. So widespread reports have documented that sexual and gender-based violence, unfortunately, continues to take place within Syria and also among displaced Syrian communities in bordering countries. And this phenomenon remains among the unspoken horrors of the war due to the social and cultural stigma attached to such incidents. For the past 10 years, the international community, UN agencies, and civil society actors mobilized really to support the Syrian people and to address the most critical humanitarian and resilience issues affecting Syrian refugee communities, as well inside the country and in the region. So in this context, it is really critical that the international community continues and redoubles its efforts to engage and support Syrian civil society, especially in the field of women's rights. And we have also to contrast really this and gender-based violence. As this panel demonstrates, the voice of women's civil society organizations is crucial to fully understand what is happening, and their contribution is critical to evaluate what is really needed on the field. In order to better tailor the humanitarian response to the needs of the affected communities, it is really paramount that their active involvement of these associations become more and more the bedrock upon which rests every segment of the humanitarian response. So yesterday and today, it's also in the newspaper and in the news, they all spoke about it. The international community is gathering in Brussels on the occasion of the 5th Brussels Conference on Syria, convened by the European Union. And this event is an opportunity to begin a process of analyzing and a process of reflection on the strategies and practices adopted to counter gender-based violence among Syrian refugee communities. And it's also an opportunity to beginning a process of strengthening and reinforcing those good practices that are based on what we call the active involvement of local communities, women's civil society organizations, together with gender-based violence survivors. Only a real empowerment of refugee women and girls will enable them to be active of their own life and meaningful actors for change, for their communities, and for the future of Syria. So after this introduction, and I would like also to thank No Peace Without Justice to organizing this event, I would like to give the floor to Ms. Zinip Aydemir Konyuncu from UN Women's Turkey Country Office for her opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon. It's a pleasure for me to be here with you today. I'd like to thank the co-chairs and also No Peace Without Justice for organizing this panel, very timely around the Brussels 5 conference. Gender-based violence, in particular against women and girls, has now globally become what is called a shadow pandemic. Emerging data shows that all types of violence against women and girls, particularly domestic violence, has intensified in the past year due to COVID-19. Globally, even before the COVID-19 pandemic began, 1 in 3 women experienced physical or sexual violence globally, mostly by an intimate partner. And in some countries, resources are now diverted from GBV response to immediate COVID-19 relief. So, referral pathways and service provision for the survivors and victims have been disrupted. As a form of violence against women and girls and a serious harmful practice, we also need to acknowledge the increasing risk of child, early and forced marriages, especially among the refugee populations. Due to the increasing poverty and vulnerabilities exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, households are unfortunately more increasingly revert to negative coping mechanisms, including early marriages. In Turkey, according to the Demographic Health Survey, even before the pandemic, 45% of Syrian girls below the age of 18 and 9% of girls below the age of 15 reported that they are either married or are living with a partner. Plus, 39% of Syrian adolescents have had a live birth or are currently pregnant with their first child. The consultations with the civil society in Turkey, led by the UN and the EU in the run-up to the Brussels V conference earlier this month, in March, also validates the gravity of the situation, that is a surge in gender-based violence. But despite all odds, interestingly, some civil society organizations mention higher access to GBV-related information due to the increase in the remote services, which enables women to access hotlines and counseling lines anonymously, rather than having to pay visits in person, thereby avoiding stigma. So that's an interesting situation. So the challenges around gender-based violence have been there and will continue to be around. Governments and other duty bearers are certainly accountable. And at this point, it is more important than ever to show concerted international and national action and commitment to end violence against women and girls. That is also part of why we are deeply concerned about Turkey's withdrawal from the Istanbul Convention, which sets the standards. Women's organizations and women's groups can be and are instrumental and transformative in addressing GBV in a humanitarian or refugee response context. The local consultations carried out by No Peace Without Justice in this field also points out this fact, the consultations that they have carried out in Turkey. And through our refugee response program in Turkey, together with our partners from the civil society, we have been working to increase women's leadership and agency in responding to the crisis in a protracted crisis context. The community-based peer-to-peer support and solidarity groups established among the refugee and vulnerable host community women and women-led referrals for GBV response, plus sharing of information regarding the referral pathways, gender-responsive protection at safe spaces for women, they are all paying off positively. And this brings us to the importance of localization of aid for women-led and women's rights organizations in preventing and responding to GBV. And as donors and implementing agencies such as the UN Women, we need to invest more collectively in the leadership capacities and core functions of women-led organizations. This investment would render the overall response more gender equal and gender responsive. And this overall approach is in line with the so-called Grand Bargain Commitments, which is an agreement between the large donors and humanitarian organizations coming from the World Humanitarian Summit of 2016. Indeed, our experience in Turkey shows that investing in the core functions of women-led organizations through grant making, one-on-one coaching and mentorship is a top priority, and we will pursue it in the coming months, including for the civil society organizations run by Syrians living in Turkey. In this way, grassroots women-led organizations can concentrate on their own capacity development, for example, by developing their strategic plans, internal policies, advocacy strategies, and etc. And they can function in a more efficient way, link up with similar organizations, and access more donor funding. So to conclude, gender-based violence, gender equality, women's rights and women's empowerment is not a distinct issue for the refugee and host communities separately, in a separate way. They are a common struggle. These are all common struggles for everyone, for all of us, for women, men, girls, and boys with all diversities. So we are all in this together. I'm happy to be with the speakers that we have today who are at the heart of the civil society. And I look forward to hearing your perspectives and insights. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this opening remarks. And also, of course, thank you again for your participation, which shows the commitment of UN Women in combating GBV among Syrian refugee communities. As you rightly said, gender-based violence, gender equality, women's rights, and empowerment is or are all a common challenge. But I would also agree with you, as you also mentioned, that vulnerable elements in societies need also specific attention. With that, I would turn to our panelists. I will just introduce them in, briefly as they appear on the list. We have with us Yasmina Benchi from Freedom Jasmine organization, Wala Alouche from Equity and Empowerment, Haima Yousfi from Syrian Women Journalist Network, and also Muna Zainuddin from Women Now for Development. Maybe in a quick round, I would ask you for a preliminary remarks, and maybe also if you can at the beginning introduce yourself more. Yasmina, please, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Yasmin Benchi. I am the executive director of human rights organization Freedom Jasmine. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Can you hear me all? Can you hear me in English? At the beginning, I would like to thank the organizers of this event because it gives us the opportunity to speak about a very important topic that concerns women and violence against women. Today, I will talk about the violence against the detainees, which is the heart of our work at Freedom Jasmine. Violence against women in prisons, against women detainees, which was practiced in detention centers and prisons. I am one of those who was subjected to violence in detention centers. In fact, the Syrian regime and some parts of the crisis, they used the violence against women detainees as a pressure, as a weapon. Since 2011, lots of types of violence were practiced against women detainees. First of all, the physical torture, and also to get confessions by force, and also they used some harassment and rape, which were practiced against women in several detention centers. In the, for example, the 215 section branch, which is very well known, that they practice sexual rape and sexual violence against women, which is they fetch women fully naked. They fetch them and they search them naked in front of everybody. The other type of violence, which is the most widespread is the violence practiced against women through the psychological pressure against them. Usually it's inside the detention center. At the beginning, they forced the disappearance, and also in the detention center, they don't inform their parents, their family. Families, they don't know if they are arrested in this center or that station or no, and they are transferred. And also the humanitarian conditions inside those centers, they deprive them from food, the hunger. They get very little quantity of food, and also they give one meal or maybe two meals, and also this is part of the torture, and also the detention in a very bad humanitarian conditions, no health care, no cleanliness even, and the personal needs. We all need. Women has a physiology, a physical need. Certain needs for women are different. All women were deprived from this, and also the medical care also is in not existing. No detention center. There was a woman who was who had cancer. She needed her doses of medicines. She was deprived from her medicines even.
شكرا ياسمينة.
Thank you, Yasmina. I will move on to Wala Alloush. Please, Wala.
تمام صباح الخير يعطيكم
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the invitation, and also would like to thank No Peace Without Justice. I'm Wala Alloush from Idlib countryside. I'm director of Equity and Empowerment Project. I worked for a long time on Syrian women in northwest Syria until the end of 2017. When I left Idlib, I worked for years with violent women survivors from violence, and we worked with our team in publishing lots of documents that document violence against women, different forms of violence during a crisis, and also the forms that we have seen after 2011 also that affect all their life. I have met so many violence women, victims of violence in the communities. I always say that would it be possible that there is no woman who is not subjected, who is not victim of violence? I couldn't imagine that. In 2015, I met a young girl in a camp. She was 16 years old. She was married 6 times. The third marriage, each marriage she was subjected to rape from her husband. The third marriage, she had a miscarriage. She lost her maternity. She lost her husband, divorced her, and also the community. They had the stigma on her because she is divorced. Imagine 16 years old, and after 3 marriages, she had this stigma of a divorced girl, and also she cannot produce. She lost her reproductive system. She cannot have children. This is the reality in Syria. We always need to work on this GBV to document this violence. Violence in Syria has different forms. Of course, we see it in all communities all over the world. But from what I worked in several communities in North Syria, Northwest Syria, and Turkey, each community has its own type of violence. New forms rise every day. New forms are created every day. There's an explosion of those forms of violence, you know, for women. Now they start talking about I will not add more than this, but maybe later on, and later on we can talk more about it. Thank you.
At least 2 rounds of questions afterwards, and Nicola, I would leave to you the comments on these preliminary interventions. But now I will turn to Haima, please.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for the co-chairs, and thanks to No Peace Without Justice for this event, especially now that we're having the Brussels 5 conference about Syria and the region. I'm Haima Al-Yousfi. I'm a Syrian feminist and human rights defender. I work with SFJN, the Syrian Female Journalist Network. I'm the Women, Peace and Security Project Coordinator. I also have a background in advocacy and communication, and I hold an MA in risk and security from Durham University in the UK. Today, I will take the conversation into a different aspect. Maybe I will address the role of media in combating gender-based violence. So as you all know, media has a vital role in eliminating or combating the gender-based violence and raising awareness about the incidents and raising the awareness and providing knowledge to communities and societies. So I will address how important to have a responsible and balanced media reporting about these cases, to have how the media has ethical responsibility when interviewing the survivors or victims of SGBV, and also how can we collaborate as civil society organizations, feminist organizations, and also media organizations into combating this phenomena, and also into not reproducing stereotypes around women and men, and especially in the refugees communities. It's also very important to address that the collaborative approach is something very crucial and vital when talking about the cases of gender-based violence, and to have sensitive reporting, also combining with advocacy around these issues. I won't take more time, as I understand that we will have questions and I can go more in details around these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Haima. Thank you. And well, I now have in mind a question for you, but I will keep it till the next round, and I will turn to Muna, please.
Hello. First of all, I would like to thank No Peace Without Justice for inviting me for this panel and putting this work together, and to my colleagues for their previous interventions. My name is Muna Zainuddin, and I'm the programs manager at Women Now for Development, and I'm a human rights defender and intersectional feminist activist. So to give just a background on Women Now for Development, it's a feminist woman-led NGO dedicated to deepening and strengthening women's role in Syrian and host communities by enhancing their political, social, and economic participation. We implement programs out of the Women and Girls Safe Space models, and we currently run 2 in northern Syria and 2 in the Bekaa, Lebanon. And in addition to providing empowerment, participation, and protection services through our centers, we also work on advocacy and community mobilizing, as well as research. And for the past year and a half or so, we've been working extensively on sexual and gender-based violence as part of our research and advocacy work. in order to better understand the realities facing survivors of sexual violence, and to better understand sexual and gender-based violence, and to better understand their challenges, needs, and perceptions of justice and equality. And in a research called Surviving Freedom that was carried out by Women Now in collaboration with the Aini Ainak platform, we focused on the realities of female survivors of detention after their release. Now, these women were not necessarily survivors of sexual violence, although some of them were, but we were more interested in the realities that they faced once they were released from prison. And it focused on 82 stories that really brought to light the violence that's brought about once detention has ended, and how survivors walk into another kind of violence, that is stigma, that is perpetrated by their communities, who always associate, or in many cases associate, detention with rape, and who judge victims as criminals or somehow responsible for the violations that they endured during detention. And I would like to read a quotation from one of the survivors that we interviewed. She says, "I wish I was still imprisoned. At least there I know that I am at the mercy of cruel strangers. Today I am facing the injustice of the people whom I waited to throw myself into the arms of upon my release, and feel a kindness and compassion that I have not yet experienced." So what this research really brought to light was the extent of stigma that survivors face. And when I say stigma, it happens in all different types of forms. It could be on the social level, where women are rejected from their families, but it also sometimes happens in the sense that a woman is rejected by her community, so that, or is very ashamed of speaking about her experiences, and that stops her from seeking the necessary support that she needs, such as psychosocial support. In some instances, it's on the economic level, where people are reluctant to employ this woman because she has this history of being a former detainee. So it really brought to light the very different types of stigmatizations faced by former detainees, and how the stigmatization often hinders their ability to reach out for necessary support services. And it really also taught us the extent to which, sexual and gender-based violence is really on a continuum. It does not start in conflict. And the result of how we suffer inequalities during times of conflict, how women experience war differently, are really a result of what things looked like before. How much violence was hidden, institutionalized, and normalized in everyday life, both in peacetime and wartime, in homes, in intimate relationships, and in public spaces. And moving on, I'd like to discuss one more advocacy initiative, and that is the Syrian Road to Justice campaign, which was basically a collaboration between several feminist organizations, Women Now being one of them, but also Dawlati Bada'il and the Syrian Female Journalists Network. Basically, these feminist organizations came together some months before the filing of the first criminal complaint in Germany regarding sexual and gender-based violence that took place in detention centers. And the idea behind the campaign was, in order for female survivors to access justice, there has to be an initiative on the societal level to fight stigma and to push against and combat the barriers that are preventing women from accessing legal justice, or different types of criminal justice, or different types of justice, and to basically expand on the meaning of justice. What would a really transformative justice look like? One that transforms the actual conditions that led to the violences to begin with. So our demands include legal accountability for all international crimes that took place during the Syrian conflict, including sexual and gender-based crimes, and regardless of the perpetrator's political affiliation, and a gender-sensitive analysis for all international crimes committed in Syria from the beginning of investigation, because often a barrier to justice is the lack of female practitioners within the litigation or judicial system, and the lack of gender expertise. And when we say, when we ask for an improvement on that, we're meaning every step of the legal litigation process in order to help survivors speak up for justice. So more female police officers, more criminal investigators, more lawyers, judges who have gender expertise. We also demand an increased support and specialist services for SGBV survivors to ensure that they're able to seek justice and hold perpetrators of abuse to account, and more awareness raising and community mobilizing initiatives to tackle social discrimination or stigma, which causes greater suffering for SGBV survivors and prevents them from seeking justice. And for this,
we will go back to this particular point in due course during the discussion.
Okay, if my time is up, it's fine. I was going to add one more point, but I'm happy to open it for discussion.
No, please go ahead.
Okay, and for this reason, it is great news that the court in Koblenz, the Koblenz Higher Regional Court, updated the charges against main defendant Anwar R, and incidents of sexual violence are now indicted as crimes against humanity. The recognition of a crime against humanity is an acknowledgement that these offenses are so egregious that they violate the human dignity of the victims' survivors and are a concern of humanity as a whole. And very importantly, the recognition of conflict-related sexual violence in Syria as a crime against humanity, rather than random individual acts, acknowledges the extent to which it acknowledges the context in which the crimes were committed, the impact that the crimes have had on the communities at large, and encourages more critical thinking into what constitutes a civilian population and how a population is affected by a particular crime. Thank you.
Thank you, Muna. And now, Nicolo, please, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I just hearing the testimony from Syria, from the expert. I think we really have to acknowledge that the impression or the general thinking that during conflict and insecurity, women become victims of war crimes and crimes against humanity by the other side, by the bad guys, which is, of course, the case. And there is enormous evidence of crimes being committed against women by the Assad regime, as was just mentioned by Mona, in detention or elsewhere, is accompanied by an additional reality, a complementary reality, which is that the patriarchal system and the sense and the idea, which is perpetrated in many ways, not just in the communities, but worldwide, that somehow women are or should be an object of protection, not a rights holders in themselves. And even perhaps camouflaged by best intentions, or sometimes genuinely with good intentions, families and communities become responsible for denial of the most important right, which is agency, the right to make your own decisions. And that violation then translates into early and forced marriage, as we've tragically heard, because it's better for the girl to be raped somehow systematically by somebody who's named as the husband than to risk, being a sexual prey as an unmarried young woman. These calculations, on the one hand, evidence the tragedy in which the Syrian people were thrown into with the repression of the regime, of a peaceful uprising started 10 years ago. On the other, also, I think show that there is something missing in our own response. And I think when we have to think about prioritizing COVID response against the services for women, I think many times it's not about what you do, it's about how you do it. And how you do it, doing it properly doesn't cost anymore. It's just a way of shift in the way you think. I think the voices that we heard today give us the same messages of the voices we heard during the survey that was conducted, that women's rights is first of all about agency, about recognition that the other person is human and they're not a child and they're not an object of something that has to be preciously kept in the minds of men making a decision, but the right of women is first of all a right of sovereignty over themselves. This is what I hear loudest and clearest in the stories we've heard today. Now, in terms of where we take it from now and from here, I always look, analysis for analysis is no good. Even analysis for recommendations to somebody else is not so good. What should we do? What are the recommendations we make to ourselves? And that's what I hope to lead. If you have questions, well, that's what I hope they will lead for the next step. Let's not make recommendations to the UN or to the EU. Let's also see where we take it from here.
Thank you, Nokolo. Thank you. You touch upon the exact point. This is what we need to think about, and I hope this discussion will lead us to some effective points that we can work on in the future. I will start my the first round of questions with Wala. For the past year, you and your organization worked with No Peace Without Justice to elaborate a field research in Turkey among Syrian refugee communities and host communities, and developed specific recommendations to collect the voice of Syrian refugee women and girls living in Turkey. What is the role that women's rights organizations play in supporting Sgbv survivors and women facing violence in general? And what are the challenges you have or you had to face in your work?
شكرا أسامة.
Thank you. حسين مش أسامة.
ليس فقط
At the beginning, it's not only survivors, but violence to women subjected to violence. Sometimes we don't know if she's survivor or violenced because she herself, she cannot define if she is a victim or survivor. So the civil society organizations, the women NGOs and women activists, the importance is to respond to SGBV victims effectively in the past years, to focus on the peace for women and security, 1625 for women. We were focusing on the women participation, protection and prevention, a little bit on the recovery. I will talk more about Turkey and the organizations in Turkey. Most of the women organizations who have programs with women work actively on combating SGBV and in track for awareness for this community in all forms of violence against women and girls, and the impact and consequences of this on the family, the community. I would like to get into one challenge here, or a bump we had here. So for years we were focusing only with women. So this reduced the path of change to reduce this violence. Violence is a closed circle that affect all community, not only women. men also are also he's a partner with the SGBV. There's an important role also by monitoring those cases through reports, as Haima and Zainab and others mentioned. The reports that gives a better understanding of SGBV facing women and girls within their communities. We worked in Turkey. So many have been done in the Syrian communities. The reports are, we go to the communities to build their interventions on GBV and SGBV, and also in Turkey there's a coordination and media campaigns for those women or those victims, how they can reach those lines. For example, the application launched by the Ministry of Interior in Turkey in 2019. In the media, there's a large media campaign to show women how they can use this application for refugees. Also, it's in Arabic. Also, we know that the economic part is very important for this violence and the GBV or SGBV, but also the domestic violence. Also, we worked with the NGOs to reduce a little bit from the domestic violence and the other violence through economic empowering projects for women, through to empower her so she will be less subjected to violence. Also, there's some civil society organizations, they activated the response lines, but not enough, in Turkey. We know in Turkey, there is a dissemination of the GBV and domestic violence widespread in Turkey. Also, Syrian organizations, they activated this for Syrian women, but we need more activation, more access to outreach for those women who don't have experience, who don't have communication tools. Organizations also play an important role for recovery. We did not work enough, but we were focusing before on protection and prevention. But I wanted to know on those for the women in peace and security. Also on survivors, there are programs on the psychology for the reintegration in their communities, and also we for the support for survivors to reach the services and to talk about experience. My colleague Yasmina, I think in 2019 she was in the Human Rights Council, and she was speaking about her experience with other women. The civil society organization, also the women organization, they play an important role at the national track to send their message, to convey their messages. There were several roles. I wanted to summarize, of course, they have more important, more other roles, and maybe my colleagues can mention them. So now the challenges, of course, there have so many challenges. And different, from 2011 until 2017, I was working in the field on the ground. The main challenge that remains until today, that there is no protection for defenders, for human rights defenders, especially women rights defenders, especially in the field, on the ground, and they are subjected to arrest, detention, to killing, and also they are they are rejected by communities, whether they are inside Syria or outside Syria. Those defenders, female defenders in Syria, I was subjected to several times several risks, security risks. reaching women, we reaching women victims. That was one of the main challenges that we were facing. Also in Turkey, we faced this a lot to reach women, especially women who don't have the communication tools. There is a gender gap here in the technical, gap for women to use the technology. The good number of women, they don't know how to use the social media. They don't know how to use application. The lack and absence of their knowledge of internet, also this plays a role. And also that's why this makes reaching them difficult and very little through the media. And talking, difficult in talking about those women on SGBV, especially those women are rejected, especially when when we were all women together. It was very embarrassing for them. It is even taboo for them to talk about this, even individual interview, it was difficult. But to talk about sexual violence, that was difficult for them to talk about it. Of course, it's impossible to reach men also. This is impossible for awareness, and also to talk about sexual violence because of the tradition and stigma. This is in all communities. So if I want to talk about the deterioration, the deteriorated situation in the camps for women, of course, they focus on their basic needs, their living, housing, shelter. So they neglect all other impacts or consequences of violence, But during the corona, there was an explosion of this. There were several cases. A woman committed suicide. A woman put fire on herself in her tent. There was an explosion of this violence. So neglect is not easy. So we face lots of challenges as women, as defenders. I remember in 2019, I was participating on the consequences of war on women after 2011. The number of comments, bad comments, and the defamation against me I received because I participated in the survey. What they attacked me and my family, the defamation I received from my family. Even they threatened me. They said, you have to stop this because we are getting a headache because of you. So those are the challenges, personally, that I faced in my work in the past years.
Thank you. Obviously, big and difficult challenges you have to face always in your work. I will turn to Yasmina. Many refugees have been victims or witnesses of incidents involving SGBV committed by all warring parties in Syria. Gender-based and sexualized violence has been and continue to be widespread in the context of war, as many times reported by UN agencies and civil society organizations. In your work in the organizations, and also as a member of the detainees committee of the office of the Geneva office, what are the challenges facing former detainees or wives of detainees, relatives of forcibly disappeared people? Please.
شكرا جزيلا. أنا ما رح
Thank
كرر
you, thank you. I will not repeat what my friend Wala mentioned, because she mentioned lots of topics that I wanted to mention. I will give the challenges that we are facing, whether as survivors or working with the survivors or the families or relatives of survivors or released from detention. So the problem is the stigma. Stigma for detainees is a major disaster for them in two parts. The first one is the traditions and customs in the community, the old traditions that consider any detainee, female detainee, that she is subjected to be raped immediately. So the second stigma is the exaggeration by the media that was used in the past years, that exaggerates the rape, and also, for empathy or sympathy, but this exaggerates for the release, the women when they are released. So this is a major challenge for the survivors or dealing with them, also to document with them. This led them to close themselves, also without to communicate with others, even to stay at home or to run away, because so many survivors, they ran away from their families because of the stigma. The family don't want this girl to stay with them and to cause the shame for them, and stigma and because of the traditions and the customs. The second point, the lack of those survivors to reintegrate, because they do not find the support, financial, social, and to adapt with the community, to continue with their community. In fact, after I was released from detention, I did not find any organization serious that initiate any support for me and for survivors and who were with me in 2014. In fact, the issue of the family support for me was stronger than those organizations. And because of my family support, I managed to survive and continue and proceed until now, to be with you now. In 2019, in the Security Council, I was talking about the survivors and what they are subjected to violence. Also, another important point Wala mentioned, I would like to reiterate and also talk about the lack of access to those survivors. We have two areas which is difficult to deal with them, with the survivors. The first one is the regime areas, areas controlled by regime. It's impossible to reach those women, those survivors, to talk with her, to document or to reintegrate her, and also to because she is subjected to the stigma and the community violence. And the second, she's subjected to violence from her family, from the community, or she could be subjected to arrest again by the regime. The second part of the survivors, those who are in the areas outside the regime control. Also, the community is harder on that survivor, is even harsh on them in the community because of this stigma. Also, the dealing with them. In fact, the areas, there are not so many in the where outside the regime control. We can reach them. We can find lots of survivors, most of them who ran away from their communities inside Syria. They ran from their families because they want to go outside, far from their families, but they are also subjected to torture, psychological torture or community torture, because of lots of harassment. An important point also I would like to mention, the issue of the wives of detainees, wives of men detainees. We deal with the families of the detainees, the wives. We did not talk about them. Very few activists deal with them. the wives of the detainees, after now they are without a husband, they are subjected to a stigma. Say, this woman, she is without a husband, there's no one with her, etc. And they practice another form of violence, which is very serious. When there is no husband, the woman or the husband is forced to marry his brother. But this is a humanitarian disaster, because so many missing people or detainees, when they returned from their detention or from disappearance, they had a shock, a psychological shock, because they found their wives married to their brothers. So this is a very widespread in the Syrian communities, but there's a blackout against those cases to protect what remains from the family in the absence of the husband. I would like to talk about another topic where we face problems for those wives, especially in Turkey. The legal problems with the document, for her document papers, and the lack of access to the official papers because of the war. The women have to get papers in Turkey. So they ask, for example, the employee, the public employee, he asks that this woman to have a paper, we need your husband's approval. She says, my husband is disappeared. What do you mean by disappeared? When you say detained, he's detained. He said, okay, ask a lawyer to get a paper from him. They don't understand what means detention in Syria. This is a long suffering for detainees in Syria. The last point I would like to mention quickly, or which was mentioned by Wala, is the bullying we are subjected to. When we talk about the sexual violence, we are subjected to lots of violence cases. So we had lots of reports on sexual violence, rapes, sexual violations that the women detainees are subjected. In each report, in each video we publish as an organization on social media, we are subjected to huge amount of bullying. Even in our meetings, when we talk about GBV, there are so many people who harass us, they insult us because they don't want us to mention this. And also the second part of the session, I may talk about some suggestion from the civil society organizations for this. Thank you so much. I move on to Mona.
One of critical elements for combating SGBV and ensure justice and accountability for victims is to have legal, judicial, and reporting mechanisms. And you have mentioned that you took part in the Syrian Road to Justice campaign. How civil society organizations are operating to reduce and eliminate the barriers to justice faced by SGBV survivors?
Thank you for your question. And I've already spoken a little bit about that, but I'm happy to go into more depth. So to explain how it all started, I mean, the organizations that I mentioned, Women Now for Development, Bada al-Dawlati, and the Syrian Female Journalists Network, they came together shortly before, a couple of months before the filing of the first criminal complaint that was filed in Germany. And this is based on the principle of universal jurisdiction, because as we know, there's no international tribunal in Syria. So all criminal justice attempts right now are happening through very limited avenues. And these are through national courts that have universal jurisdiction mandates, Germany being one of them and having one of the most widest jurisdiction mandates. So before the filing of the complaint, the organizations came together because we knew that there would be trouble for many of the survivors on many levels. I mean, for any survivor of detention, there's always this trouble of being able to go forward and seek justice openly due to largely stigmatization that comes from the society at large. So the campaign aimed basically to work to mitigate and combat the stigmatization by raising awareness of it, as well as basically having other really strong demands concerning the criminal justice itself. The first being legal accountability for all crimes, including sexual and gender-based crimes. And very importantly, we really pushed towards having gender-sensitive analysis for all crimes, not just Sgbv. And this is for a very critical reason, because gender-based violence happens in all crimes, and it's not just limited to incidents of when sexual violations happen. So this is why it's important to have this the comprehensive gender analysis from the beginning of the process. As my colleague Yasmina mentioned, I mean, yes, when it comes to arbitrarily detentions, there are hidden gender dynamics that we're not aware of sometimes. And you won't be able to gauge and capture them unless you begin this analysis from the very beginning of the process. And the beginning of the process, we mean like from when the woman comes forward to report to the police officer. If the police officer does not have gender expertise, if you don't also have enough female officers, this is going to be a factor that draws a barrier between the victim survivor and the justice avenue. To criminal investigators, to lawyers, all the way up to to judges who are, making the indictments. It's very important that all these individuals throughout the process have this level of expertise so that they're able to gauge the very nuanced and often hidden gendered impact. And we also, pushed for having more support and specialist services, because as we know, the litigation process is a very difficult one. The survivor has to go back to certain memories, has to talk about very traumatizing incidents. So it's crucial to have psychosocial support services, as well as other specialist services pertaining to the protection of these survivors, as we know that they could endure, threats from different sides. As well as we demanded for awareness raising and community mobilizing initiatives to tackle social discrimination and to really, raise consciousness among the communities about how survivors are discriminated against so many times once they come out of detention. One of them being they're often associated with rape, and that has caused a lot of stigmatization for many survivors to be automatically associated with that. And it also, it's a problematic on another level, because sexual violence happens on a wide continuum. And it's not just about rape. It could happen in different forms. So when you eclipse it with just rape, it causes a lot of problematic issues for survivors of other different types of crimes. Yes, and as mentioned, a couple of weeks ago, it's good news that the Koblenz Higher Regional Court decided to update charges, and now sexual violence has been indicted as a crime against humanity. And again, this is critical because it's also, it highlights how this crime goes beyond individual suffering, how it affects communities at large. And as we know, one example I can give is that many Syrian families inside Syria chose to leave the areas that they were living in out of the fear that their daughters might experience sexual and gender-based violence. So this is the extent to which this crime really affects the community. It goes beyond individual suffering. So that's why its indictment in this form was an important step, I would say.
Thank you, Mona, for going to these details. I would like also to ask Haima to go more in depth with something that you mentioned in your first intervention. Access to information is a critical element for refugee communities. It can facilitate integration in the host country, break the sense of isolation, and empower women. And you, as you also mentioned that you are coordinator of the Women, Peace and Security Project with the Syrian women journalists. What is the role that media can play in combating SGBV and supporting civil society organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Hussein, for the question. First, I would start with the first part about the refugee communities. I would identify between neighboring countries and refugees in Europe because some of the neighboring countries like Lebanon and Jordan, the access to information would be rather easy because of the same language. So the language barrier is not present in that cases. But for example, in Turkey, I know that there are a lot of organizations and government institutions that have their own, for example, hotlines and shelters for women victims or survivors, but not the communities of refugees that don't speak the Turkish language might not have the access to this information. Even though there are a lot of initiatives that provide this information, but I will also re-mention the factor related to connectivity and access. So not all women have mobile phones or have the knowledge to navigate the internet. So this is very important to address when talking about access to information and knowledge. In places like Europe, I would say also the language barrier is an important factor here. And the other thing is because of the general understanding that these countries, for example, they have the laws and legislation that can protect women from violence or domestic violence. So I would say there's a lack of civil society initiatives and media outlets that speaks Arabic language or report on these cases in Arabic in accessing the information and giving the information to the refugee communities. So I would say here it's very important to connect Arabic-speaking media outlets with local civil society initiatives and the government institutions in these countries in Europe in order to create a collaborative kind of work or campaign to provide the knowledge and information to the Syrian women refugees. The other factor in Europe, for example, there's the reproducing of stigmatization when I mentioned that I mentioned earlier. So for example, in these communities, we need to be very careful when reporting in these incidents, not to recreate a different kind of discrimination against Arab Muslim men in these countries as violent or as violent men and violent communities. So and this create a burden also on the women who want to report such incidents, not to do this kind of stigma against men of their communities, their husbands, their brothers, and the community in general. So it's important to understand that also media has a vital role in combating stigmatization. It also has a role in creating the, other types of stigma. And media outlets need to be aware of this. So the other thing that media outlets do when reporting about these incidents is is using maybe generic images or kind of sensitization of language and dramatic titles, for example. So this is something negative that the media outlets do generally when reporting about these incidents. There are sometimes some media outlets who provide willingly or unwillingly information that identifies the victims or the predators, and it's very important that media outlets avoid disclaiming or mentioning any kind of identifying information that can violate the privacy and the security of women victims or survivors. Also, another important issue is to use a clear and explicit language when talking about gender-based violence, and not and name the people who commit such violations and crimes, with keeping into account that these people as well has the right to defend themselves and to go later to court. So not be judgmental when also talking about predators, for example. The victimhood narrative is something very big, and it was and still being used by organizations working with survivors, and also through media outlets, and I would here say also in social media, as it's an alternative media, if we might say so. Portraying women only as victims or heroes is something very harmful, and also creating more stereotypes when talking about these issues. So one important thing that the Syrian Road to Justice campaign did through its work, that the team provided also information and quotes and opportunities for women practitioners and experts to speak about this issue, and not only victims that telling their stories as victims and as trying to create empathy only, but as experts who know the overall aspects of violence. It's also important for the media outlets and the alternative media to talk about violence, not only when an incident happened and not only about physical violence. It's also important to report and talk about cyber violence, as Yasmina mentioned earlier, economic violence, and also the root causes of this violence, including the systematic aspects of it, and the authorities, for example, in the area, government institutions, and armed groups, culture and education as the deep reasons of gender-based violence. The very final thing that I want to mention is also training for media practitioners, journalists, and editorial teams in the media outlets about gender-sensitive and conflict-sensitive journalism, providing them with the tools and skills to conduct ethical interviews, and also to report with a sensitive language about these issues is very crucial, taking into account that a large number of reporters and journalists inside Syria are citizen journalists that might not have the opportunity to study journalism in like a university or an institution. So providing knowledge also to the teams and train them about these matters and issues is very important. And collaboration between civil society organization, feminist organization is very important as well to produce the content, especially that these organizations are the one working on the ground. They have access to a lot of communities, families, and camps, for example, and they can help media outlets and journalists to connect to the right people, and also to help provide knowledge and access to these communities. I think I covered a lot of aspects. It's a large topic, and I just want to mention that SFJN is doing media monitoring and analysis through its program Gender Radar. And last month, the program produced a report about discrimination against women in the media called سقطنا سهوا. And also in regards to safety and security, also the safety and security program conducted a survey last year when the pandemic outbreak started in many areas in the world, and it was focused on the challenges and risks faced human rights defenders and women journalists in the region. So it's very important to produce knowledge and content in that regards.
Thank you, Hima. I'm totally agree with you. I always thought that media is the right tool that should work with the right side, with the victims, with the human rights activists. But obviously, it was a long way to go through for Syrian civil society organizations. Is our co-chair available? I will pass the floor to you, Natalie. I know you have other commitments, but I hope you still have some time. The microphone, Natalie, please.
Yes, I have, of course, it's okay, I can manage. And thank you very much for passing me the floor, and thank you very much for our speakers for all what they already told us. And it really, we have to say that women and girls, when there is a conflict coming, are in a position of disadvantage. And when the conflict begins with the destruction, the displacement, women and girls are unfortunately targets for disempowerment as families, groups, societies, including newly formed societies, like, for example, as far as they can, refugee communities. This maybe is not always due to ill will, but sometimes it's based on survival strategies that aim to protect women and girls, denying their agency and violating their human rights. One of the speakers mentioned, for example, the forced marriage aimed, quote, to protect, but at the end it's a violation of rights. With the Syrian conflict entering its 10th year, the situation in the region remains really critical. We face a humanitarian situation with millions of Syrians displaced or having sought refuge in Syria's neighboring countries. And it's even worse now with the COVID-19 pandemic situation. The pandemic situation has exacerbated health hazards, including inadequate sexual and reproductive health care. I think, yeah, one of the speakers spoke about the failure of medicines, the failure of care, and even of fundamental products for the healthcare. Syrian refugee communities, as we heard, have been particularly affected by the spread of the virus, with more severe repercussions on women and girls, aggravating pre-existing inequalities and this social cultural discrimination. This chaotic environment in which refugees are forced to live, and their precarious conditions, also in terms of psychological and physical security, lead to the need of seeking certainties in traditional role, probably, and it reinforces this fallback to patriarchal power structures of the family. In reality, maybe we can see a kind of harmful coping mechanism which constitute a community oppression of women and girls. So to follow the discussions, I would like to ask Yasmina Benshi the following question. The SGB survivors, as we discussed, face an enormous amount of challenges, not only physical, but also psychological trauma, but frequently also, you name it, the rejection by their own families and the communities after they have been subjects of sexual gender-based violence. So it's a kind of second trauma, or a trauma that is extended in the time with the feeling that it will never end. The sufferer will never end. So given your role in the community and on the field, what could really do the civil society in combating the stigma that is attached to gender-based violence, and what can do the organizations as yours to favor the reintegrations of a survivor in the society? In some country, for example, the gender-based violence, the work on it is also done in partnership with the author. But of course, for working with the author, you have to cultivate the self-consciousness that they have been doing something really hard and really unacceptable. That is maybe something that can be talked about, or other ideas you have given your experience on the field, what really can be done. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا.
Thank you so much. For the role of the civil society at the beginning, it's the issue of raising awareness in the community for all segments of the community, not only women. The women know what her rights and the do's and don'ts, but we have to raise awareness for all parts of the community to reject the old traditions that I agree with my colleague Hima of the advocacy, and also through the social media, through certain policies supporting women, victims or survivors. I would like also to reiterate the issue of supporting survivors and to empower them. Empowering is important because it reduces the stigma. When the survivor is empowered, she can defend herself and her rights without being subjected to other shocks, and she can without isolating herself. No, in fact, I worked on a report that talked about the several phases of supporting survivors. I divided it into 3 phases. The first phase is the immediate phase, which is for the medical and psychological and logistic and financial support immediately after her release. Immediately, the second phase, what we call it, the short-term phase, by empowering the survivors socially and legally and psychologically. And I focused on the psychology. This is very important in case the survivor, when she overcome this shock and the trauma, you can empower her legally and financially. The supporting women survivors in the study in the host communities, and also obtaining her papers, the papers she lost, to get her official papers. And also in the communities, especially in the neighboring countries, Turkey, where I am now, when the survivor, when she comes from detention, when she arrives, she has a great gap, which was in the language, technology, and the other issues of the country, the host country. She needs to be reintegrated in the community with the support of the organizations. My colleague Mona mentioned the legal follow-up is very important, and to continue in litigation. Documentation. We have to document all violations, and the violation, not only rape, there are lots of forms of violations, sexual violations. We need to document all forms of violations. And before the end, supporting the women organizations or with women leadership, because women are better know about women survivors, and they are closer to them in documentation, empowering, communicating with them. It's easier and better for the woman. And finally, I would like to thank the organizers of this event, this session. We thank No Peace Without Justice. Thank you for all the participants, and I hope that we will have more meetings like this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. And really, it's important your focus about documentation to collect evidence, and to transform the mentality of everybody, not only of the women and the victims and their family, but also of the men and of all the society. I have a question to Wala. There is a conference starting today, and we have a declaration in the press from Josep Borrell, the head of diplomacy of the European Union. He's co-chairing the conference of Brussels with Mark Lowcock, Under Secretary General of the United Nations. And his words is that the EU wants to keep up with the humanitarian drama of Syria and avoid that Syria drama be forgotten. So what do you think, how can the international community further strengthen the role of women's and feminist organizations in supporting the sexual gender-based survivors? What would be your recommendation given your experience and all your contacts with the victim on the field?
تمام، شكرا على السؤال.
Thank you for the question. Before I answer the question, I would like to add one thing to what my colleague Yasmin mentioned. In general, in the Syrian context, we know how there's the weight of the family. Therefore, the family is the first influencer on the children, especially on women. So it's very important when we work with the survivor, the survivor from the detention or the victim of violence, we have to work with the family. When the family is convinced that there is no stigma, your daughter who was detained, she's like any other boy or man who was detained. Yasmina talked about her experience with the support of her family that facilitated her integration. So the work with the family is very important to overcome the challenges. As for the recommendations, yes, from the previous intervention, I mentioned that there are lots of new forms of violence to be added to SGBV or during crisis in Syria, whether in the detention centers or the conditions that contributed to the rise of those forms. As for the Syrian, of course, we cannot, for the Syrian drama, we cannot end without the political process. Syrian women should contribute to the political process. We need the support from all parties for more procedures, for equal rights for Syrian women, in shaping the future of Syria by her real contribution, real participation at all Syrian platforms. It's important to know that in last year we had the 1325 peace and security for women also, and also which is focusing on the setting mechanisms for the implementation of the resolutions, and also for adopting women issues, and also all the rhetorics and at the social level and also in the media. Also, there are so many recommendations. The support, my colleague Hima talked about the importance of documenting the relation between, or to strengthen the relation between the women organizations, civil society organizations. So it's important to ensure, sorry, there is okay, so it's important to support international organization and international conferences to ensure the exchange of experience between the women organizations and the civil society organizations. Also, we know that maybe the colleagues can help the maternity power of women, but to use this power for women for the local the peace, the domestic peace and the security. This should be led by women leadership and young women leadership. Also, due to its importance at the local level, to build, a basis that contributes in the building peace and security. Also, to focus on the needs assessment by the civil society organizations, to be gender-based or gender-sensitive. Also, that needs to regular update for those needs. Also, so to accelerate the transformation, also to change, from the donors to commit the civil society organizations to focus on women, and also the media, as some colleagues mentioned, to support media projects that cover the women and survivors from or victims of SGBV. And documentation is very important, to continue in supporting documentation, so that should be gender-based reports, also on also SGBV sensitive, also to support training and of people working on SGBV. And also here I mentioned an important, how it's important, so that sometimes when the people are not trained, the people, so they are supporting a survivor, no, but involuntarily they cause here another violence, they commit another violence if they are not well trained. So they should be technically and trained and informed about how to deal with the victims and survivors, and also to focus on the research on GBV and SGBV, also in the strategies, future strategies and national plans for Syria. Also to support, the comprehensive community consultations. No, we see there is no Syrian woman. No, there are lots of Syrian women. They have lots of needs. So it's important to support their programs for the consultations and the community. So it's important to continue to give the support to respond to the needs of the civil society, working with women, and also to be and also for Syria, and also to reduce the violence. With this, we need lots of work to talk about it, but at least to mitigate such forms of violence by what we mentioned. So part of it that has been done in the past. So practically, those are the recommendations that I have in mind. Thank you so much for all the organizers of this event, and for the guests, and for the speakers. And we hope that one day we will reach where there will be no violence against no one in Syria, especially GBV.
Thank you very much for those inputs, very, very valuable. And thank you for your work. Hussein?
Yes, thank you. As we are running out of time, I will continue with the round maybe briefly, and ask Haima first, and then Muna, if you have direct, concise, fast message that in the remaining time. Haima, please.
Yeah, thanks, Hussein. I won't take much. I think I also, in my previous intervention, I provided some recommendation. I would just say it's very important, not only for media practitioners, but also for civil society and NGO that have, for example, a media desk or media office and report stories or talk about gender-based violence, to use very balanced and sensitive language, to use different sources that include NGOs reports or also institutions information. It's also important to observe this issue or phenomena in its broader context. So talking about different cases of domestic violence or gender-based violence, and not only focusing on one case as it's the one exceptional story. Focus on the general problem of violence against women rather than having one particular case, and addressing the root causes, of course, of the whole program. Of the whole problem. Also follow up with the institution regularly to provide timely information and access to hotlines. I would say maybe always when talking about gender-based violence cases, to provide information related to hotlines and shelters, and how to contact the experts and the organizations that can provide help and support to victims or survivors. Always creating a space and opportunity for women to speak up and to tell their stories in their own language and in their own words. Helping them to identify themselves as they are more comfortable as victims, survivors, healing, whatever terminologies they prefer to identify themselves write about the different forms of violence against women, and not only focusing on the sexual or physical violence, because it's a systematic problem, and also addressing that media outlets and journalists as well face the same suppression sometimes, with the same limitations and challenges caused by the system, the government, or the status quo authorities in the areas where they report. And they also might face risks to their lives and stigma and also discrimination against. And finally, promote the use of SOS phone lines and promote the work of civil society and women-led organization in that regard to also show a positive image and refrain from using traumatizing or triggering content or footages when reporting about these cases.
Thank you, Haima. Muna, please.
Thank you. I won't be taking much time and I won't really repeat what my colleagues have said. I'll just be emphasizing a few points. And the first being to always look at violence as a continuum and to look at root causes and systems and structures that bring about these types of violences. And to remember that violence does not start with conflict. It's very much embedded in the structures, institutions, ways of being, norms that pre-exist, that exist before the conflict begins and that continue after the conflict ends. So to always look at it as a spectrum rather than a compartmentalized issue, and to remember that sexual violence for women is maybe perhaps one type of violence, but women endure different types of violations throughout. To consolidate the work of women-led organizations and feminist organizations, particularly those working close to the ground, and that are providing alternative forms of justice avenues, such as psychosocial support, that are working on transformative justice initiatives, that are advocating for the rights of women through justice conceptions conceived by women themselves that may not necessarily be what justice looks like for a European audience. So to really consolidate these groups working close on the ground. And to also invest in feminist knowledge production that often comes from these organizations themselves. And these are the types of productions that are really trying to understand how do women conceptualize justice. Women with particular, and here I'm not looking at a woman as a homogeneous entity. Women can be very different depending on their positionality and what they've experienced. A refugee woman in a camp in Lebanon may have very different aspirations or conceptions of justice than one residing in Europe, for instance. And it depends on a lot of other dimensions. Does the woman have a disability? Is the woman from a certain ethnicity? It all depends on the positionality, and that's why we need a more intersectional approach whenever we look at women, to not look at them as a homogeneous group, but to focus on an intersectional analysis. So yes, thank you. These are my recommendations.
Thank you so much. And I would like to thank you all. This has been a highly informative discussion. For me, I've learned a lot from this, that I would describe as exceptional panel. So thank you so much again, and I will pass the floor to Nicolo for closing remarks.
Can I add only one note? And it's not related to to sexual violence, but it's related to gender-based violence, because also inviting women as experts and speakers only when the panels and the discussion is about women issues, and International Women's Day is also a form of discrimination against women. So also addressing that women can be experts and practitioners in the different fields of work is very important, especially when having international panels and international events.
Thank you, Ayman. Thanks.
Thank you. I couldn't have said it better. Women's rights are everybody's business, and all rights are all people's business, including women's. The other thing we find is that, you know, the protected species or the endangered species syndrome, as if women's rights are the rights not to be raped, or for inheritance, or those related to the private sphere, and men have the freedom of association and the freedom of speech and everything else. This is something absolutely to be resisted. I mean, I call the CSW the place where women's rights go to die, because it's kind of the excuse to isolate all issues that relate with women, including human rights in general, to a particular week between February and March, when nothing is really going on at the UN anyway. And so we'll just make sure that, you know, the NGOs are fighting for space within that, and side events and everything is concentrated so that the women don't bother us for the rest of the year at the Security Council. That is exactly what we're fighting in saying and repeating that women's rights are human rights, and you know, women have all the other human rights too. You know, I think that's I couldn't have said it better than you have. Participation in panels is one indicator. It shouldn't substitute the reality of avoiding even large tokenism. Small tokenism is bad, and large tokenism is even worse, which is the the death of recognition of value. You know, you're there because you're a woman. Forget that. The perspectives, however, and the recognition that there are different perspectives, and including different perspectives for men, for women, and for, is important. So presence is a good indicator of in that. So I endorse completely what Haima has said with these various qualifiers, which I guess you don't need to make, but me as a white middle-aged, well, not yet middle-aged, but we are white European man, I have to keep restating for myself, if not for anybody else. I don't have conclusions to make because the panelists have already given their their take-home soundbite, or a little more than that, hopefully. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for the work that you've done in the field, that you continue to do in the field. Thank you also to Zainab for UN Women's commitment to go beyond, beyond what is necessary to what is needed and wanted by Syrian women in Turkey and elsewhere. And thank you very much to Wala, Mona, Yasmina. I mean, you've been inspirational as we knew and expected. I didn't mention Haima, but her as well. And thank you for also the other men in the panel, Hussein, for his sharing, to Natalie for having joined us for this event today. So no conclusions because you gave them, but my thank you because I owe them.
I think with this, we come to the end of our discussion. I thank you again. Thank all of you. Special thanks also to all of you. And we meet hopefully in another discussion, or we meet in Free Syria. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all of you as well.
Thank you.